Washington's view was reflected in a telegram from Secretary of Defense George Marshall to MacArthur. We want you to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of the 38th parallel. He added that he would prefer to hear that MacArthur had found it militarily necessary to do so before a UN vote.
Parallel 38 is not a factor in the military employment of our forces. Unless and until the enemy capitulates, I regard all of Korea open for our military operations.
The US was adopting a strategy of rollback. It wanted UN endorsement for this. Caught up in the euphoria of apparent victory, the General Assembly passed a resolution proposed by Britain which sanctioned the crossing of the parallel well after the actual event.
On October 7th, a rather important resolution was adopted. The United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea was established in that resolution. And that resolution compounded the ambiguity of the mission of the UN.
In fact, the October the 7th resolution was quite clear. On June the 27th, the Security Council had recommended that members of the United Nations assist the government of South Korea to resist aggression. The October vote called for a punitive war to overthrow the North Korean regime. China had close ties with the Korean communists and viewed developments with growing concern. Peking also had good relations with India, and on October the 2nd, its ambassador was summoned to a late-night meeting with Zhou Enlai. Tell your friends that we will intervene in Korea if US forces cross the 38th parallel, he told Panikkar. As intended, reports of the meeting reached Washington.
Well, they were received and thought about, but actually at the time that that warning was transmitted to us, I think it was Mr. Panikkar himself expressed some doubt about whether this warning was real. So this was a matter of judgment. General MacArthur did not think the Chinese would intervene. I shared in that mistake. You see, Providence has not given us the capacity to pierce the fog of the future with accuracy. And sometimes mistakes do occur.
In the summer, China set up a special standby army. One of the volunteers remembers the mood.
It was in September 1950. I remember we had a meeting one day in a church. Our political commissar spoke to us. He said, if your neighbor's house caught fire, would you go and help put the fire out? We all answered, yes. So we all thought that to resist American aggression in Korea was to defend our own country.
On October the 7th, some hours before the UN authorized operations in the north, United States infantry crossed the 38th parallel. Rollback was underway. The march to the Yalu and the reunification of Korea under Syngman Rhee had begun.
Well, it was no big deal crossing the 38th parallel. We were moving fast. We always found the faster you moved, the less resistance you ran into. Our regimental commander and the American commanders there pushed us, much like Patton did in World War II. And we drove, and we'd go at night.
It was all a sort of armored gung-ho, barreling along the road, going flat out. And of course no one was worrying at all about what you were passing, what you were leaving behind, or occupying the hills. We were always brought up in this business of going for the high ground, picketing the heights, never moving up a road unless you were absolutely certain that on both sides you were safe. Well, of course, this was completely alien to American armored experience, which was just woof up the road.
Some of the bypassed North Koreans took on a new role as guerrillas. On October the 14th, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung broadcast an appeal to the defenders of the northern capital, Pyongyang. Do not retreat one step further. Now we have no space in which to fall back. This was designed for consumption by MacArthur and the UN command. There was room to retreat further, into the mountain fastness along the northern border. Kim ordered a withdrawal from Pyongyang.
So an imbalance of power arose between the two sides, which was to our disadvantage. This forced us to make a temporary strategic retreat.
I requested that we, the South Korean 1st Division, be allowed to go to Pyongyang. That was because Pyongyang was the puppets, the enemy's capital, and it would be meaningless in the Korean War for the enemy's capital to have been recaptured without the participation of the Korean army. So, on the 19th of October, I was on board tank number 1, and we occupied Pyongyang. Each day we covered 25 kilometers. And there was friendly competition between the American 1st Cavalry Division and our 1st Division to reach Pyongyang.
And then soon there were shouts of that the war has ended. And people streamed into the streets. And I was shocked to see so many people still remaining in Pyongyang because most of the people had fled. They had evacuated the city. Then we saw the South Korean army marching in.
As the UN approached Pyongyang, a strange meeting took place in mid-Pacific at Wake Island. MacArthur greeted President Truman, who was hoping that some of the general's success would rub off on the Democrats in the midterm elections. This first meeting between two men of power was witnessed by Truman's staff.
One of the things that became increasingly clear as we sought to deal with a limited war is that if one is dealing with a major hero, military hero, the capacity to manage it becomes far more complicated. If successful, it is not complicated. If unsuccessful, it's unbelievably complicated.
Truman also asked MacArthur about the possibility of China intervening.
Had they interfered in the first or second months, it would have been decisive. We are no longer fearful of their intervention. They have no air force. Now that we have bases for our air force in Korea, if the Chinese tried to get down to Pyongyang, there would be the greatest slaughter.
As MacArthur was assuring Truman that the Chinese would not enter the war in any significant numbers, divisions of the Chinese People's Volunteers had begun crossing the Yalu River into North Korea.
We started off in the evening after preparing our rations. It was a pontoon bridge across the Yalu River. Lorries carrying military supplies traveled in the middle while the soldiers walked on the sides. It was a very tense atmosphere. Afterwards, a song was written for this. It goes like this.
星宿宿，喜昂昂，跨过鸭绿江，为祖国，为和平，就是保家乡。祖国好儿女，齐心团结劲，抗美援朝，打败敌美的野心狼。
The UN command was convinced the war was won, but attitudes in Washington were